Ja, deswegen sage ich jetzt schönen guten Tag. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're talking about forever chemicals today, PFAS, and this is a high-level conference with amazing speakers. I'm very pleased to have Commissioner of the Environment, Virginius Savicius, the ChemSec Director, Anna-Sophie Becker, and our Secretary of State, Christiane Rohleder, who I met during my time in Rhineland-Palatinate. I'm going to say a couple of technical things, a couple of housekeeping things in both languages. We have interpretation available today. The webinar is going to be held in English, but Zoom has an interpreting feature, which you can find either by clicking on the three little dots or by clicking on the globe symbol. So you can choose which language you prefer.
This webinar will be held in English, so in case anyone is speaking German, just press the three little dots. At least my Zoom version has three little dots there, and then you'll see a little globe which says translate, and then you can choose your respective language. Ich werde jetzt die Einleitung auf Deutsch halten, aber ansonsten...
I'm going to introduce our speakers in German, but everything else will be in English. We're recording this webinar, so if you choose to ask a question and you don't want your name to be known, you should rename yourself. You can do that by clicking on the participants symbol. Call yourself Mickey Mouse or whatever you like. Everyone's cameras and microphones will remain switched off, so we are not taking verbal contributions because we've had issues in the past. We'll hear from our speakers first. If you have any technical issues, please leave us a note in the chat box. The chat is only available for you to speak to the hosts of the webinar, not to the other participants. If you have any actual questions in terms of content, use the Q&A tool. That tool gives you the option to ask questions and also rank other people's questions. So if someone else asked a question that you think is relevant, you can give it a thumbs up to push it to the top, and then we can rank the questions. The Q&A tool jumps back and forth. Sometimes you can set it either to most recent or most liked. As I said before, we have amazing speakers today. Commissioner Virginius Savicius, Anna-Sophie Becker, Director of ChemSec, an international NGO working on chemicals, and we have State Secretary Dr. Christiane Rohleder from the Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection. And she started this job a few months ago, but we've been friends for a long time. As I said, after my introductory remarks, we will begin with Virginius Savicius' talk, and then we will do a bit of Q&A because the commissioner is very busy and will have to leave. After that, Anna-Sophie and Christiane will give their talks, and then we'll have another round of questions and answers. We should be finished by 4:30. But as the webinar is being recorded, you can always come back to listen to it again. And you can look at my other webinars as well. You can find them on my website.
So now switching to English, without further ado, I would like to hand the floor to our very precious Commissioner, Virginius Savicius. We're all very grateful that you're in the position where you are, because you already have shown your dedication in the fight for a healthy environment, and especially when it comes to chemicals. Dear Virginius, thanks for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such a kind words and such a warm welcome. And of course, good afternoon to everyone. Many thanks, Jutta, for this invitation and leadership to organize this meeting. I'm always happy to talk about our chemical strategy, because I honestly think it's one of the really powerful new tools we have under the European Green Deal, and it's helped us really strengthen our approach in several areas, PFAS is one of these areas, so I'll start with a brief introduction to specific actions on that before moving on to REACH restrictions, including the one on firefighting foams. Of course, it wasn't news that PFAS were extremely problematic. Some of them were already restricted in the EU under REACH and internationally under the Stockholm Convention. But there was a growing awareness that we needed to do more. The actions in place needed strengthening. They weren't really powerful enough to turn things around. And we found ourselves in a situation where thousands of PFAS could still be used, and that meant they often ended up in the environment. The ones that were banned were replaced by substances belonging to the same class. Experts call this a regrettable substitution. Other phrases also come to mind. Scientists were telling us that there is no point in tackling these substances one by one. We needed to regulate the whole class because even the alternatives were also for concern. So the political pressure began to mount, and in June 2019, the Council asked the Commission to develop an action plan to eliminate all non-essential uses of PFAS. Not long after that, in December that year, the Netherlands announced that they were going to restrict the use of all PFAS in non-essential uses. All the while, the work was continuing at the Commission, and when the European Green Deal was launched that same month, it promised a new zero pollution strategy for a toxic-free environment, which underlined concerns about very persistent chemicals like PFAS. Not long after this, the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability was published. It came with a detailed document on actions on PFAS, which in fact were the only chemicals that got a specific mention in the strategy. If they get special treatment, it's because they are especially dangerous. And this is now clear from many examples of contamination of soil and water that includes drinking water. We are talking about a large number of people affected with serious consequences for human health and the environment. And that, of course, entails very high costs for society and to the economy. So we needed to propose strong action and a comprehensive set of measures to address the use of PFAS and the contamination they bring. In fact, we are doing this in a number of different ways and not just under EU chemicals legislation. The PFAS action plan draws a wide range of tools through legislation and other avenues as well to address these chemicals at every stage of the life cycle. That starts with manufacturing, it goes through the use stage, and it also includes end of life. Limits have already been set for PFAS in the recast drinking water directive. There are the limit addresses, not specific chemicals, but the class as a whole. We are also preparing a proposal to revise EU legislation on pollutants in surface and groundwaters with the intention of adding PFAS and corresponding limit concentrations to the lists of polluting substances in the Environmental Quality Standards Directive and the Groundwater Directive. The Commission will also propose limits for specific PFAS in some types of food under the Food Contaminants Regulation. This proposal will be discussed with the member states very soon. We also need to act on soil, as many cases of groundwater and drinking water contamination actually start as soil pollution. So we are taking decisive steps in that direction, starting with the soil strategy adopted by the Commission late last year. One aim of the strategy is preventing the release of emissions of hazardous substances into soil. And that's why it announces the coming soil health law, which will include identification and remediation of priority contaminated sites. Moving on to the chemicals legislation, as I said, the objective is to phase out the use of PFAS across the EU unless a particular use is proved to be essential for society. Of course, we need to be very careful about what we mean by essential use. That's why the Commission will define criteria for this particular issue. We are unlikely, for example, to agree that PFAS use is essential in kitchen equipment, consumer textiles, or the wax you put on your skis. but it might be very reasonable to assume that some other uses really are essential. We may have no choice in some medical devices or protective clothing, at least until a better alternative comes along. So you might consider that the use of PFAS in firefighting foams is essential, as these foams clearly protect human lives and property in the event of fire, but there are alternatives. And in many cases, these PFAS should be replaced. The Commission has therefore decided to start the process of banning all PFAS in firefighting foams. We are doing this because firefighting foams are a major pathway for emissions to soil, and they also cause significant direct emissions to surface waters. This is not a theoretical concern. There are documented cases of this happening in the EU and around the world, and we need to prevent it from happening again and stop any future contaminations before they come about. And assuming we succeed, this could represent the first example of restricting such a large group of chemicals in one go. The Chemicals Agency has finalized this year, and it is now being discussed in the scientific committees. I expect the procedure to take 1 year. It will be very important to assess the extent to which fluorine-free alternatives can replace PFAS in all firefighting foams, while paying particular attention to sites where large quantities of flammable liquids are stored. The first public consultation has been launched, and it runs until September. Stakeholder contributions will be essential, so I very much hope you can spread the word about the consultation. And we expect to receive the opinion from Chemicals Agency scientific committees 1 year from now. And at that point, we expect to start drafting the legislation. In the meantime, authorities from the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, and Norway are preparing a dossier to restrict all other uses of PFAS. The work that is ongoing on firefighting foams will help these 5 authorities in their task, because the reasons for restricting this whole group will be discussed and agreed in the dossier on firefighting foams. PFAS really are different. They need different treatment. And when you stop the emission of a non-persistent contaminant, the concentration in the environment begins to decrease. And in some cases, it can fall quite sharply over time. That's not the case for PFAS. They are called the forever chemicals for a very good reason. As far as we can see, they really do stay in the environment forever. For that reason, it's essential to both prevent their emission and to remediate the existing pollution when there is any risk of it compromising resources needed for human life. So I don't want PFAS in my drinking water or in my fish, and I'm sure you don't want that either. So that's why we are taking such strong action under REACH, and it's why we are determined to use all the tools in the box to make this pollution a thing of the past. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Virginius. That was a lot of information in a very short time. So actually, I'm not even sure whether I caught everything, and I might have to watch my own recording afterwards. I do have a question here. I'm not sure. Did I understand correctly? The hazard or the risk assessment is being done now on the firefighting foams file. So it won't have to be repeated when we are talking about the general ban. Did I understand this correctly?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So basically the question of what is an essential use, because of course that's the crucial question that the Commission will have to decide for sure. What kind of arguments, what kind of parameters will you be looking at? Will it be an economic view? Will it be a health view? Will you try to combine the two? Because basically you might get different answers from different people of what is essential, right?
So yes, absolutely correct. So Commission is currently still working to define the criteria for essential uses. And it is really a complex exercise, and This work will take at least until the end of the year to be finalized. It will then not be possible to use official essential use criteria in the PFAS restrictions. However, REACH has tools that can be used to decide which uses of PFAS would still need to be allowed until safer alternatives are available, such as the analysis of alternatives and of course socio-economic assessment.
Okay, so it's still a matter of definition, and I take it that the Commission will probably take the view of scientists into account. Absolutely. Which will be consulted for that, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I have a question from the audience, from Michael, who says that the use of PFAS on airports, especially military airports, is rather common. And is there an obligation to lay open where those substances have been used, so where we have to look for contamination in the soil, in order to be able to remedy it at the end of the day?
First of all, we're looking at the essential uses, and of course, aviation security is a very important matter. As we speak about the airports, substitution is already happening without actually legislation, without obligation for remediation. But we see this work is quite well advancing.
Yeah, it was rather the question. I mean, they have been used already, and there are multiple sites I know of where we have contamination of the soil. But the question is there an obligation to lay open where they have been used, or can it be kept secret?
So, due to, first of all, due to the lack of dedicated soil protection at the EU level, member states currently do not have an obligation to keep a register for polluted sites or to report these sites at EU level. And the Commission, therefore, does not have an overview of the number and locations of sites contaminated with PFAS in the member states. We will consider options for the improvement of the identification and registration of contaminated sites in the proposal for new soil health law that we intend to put forward in 2023, in the first half of the year. So this should contribute to the achievement of the zero pollution ambition and the remediation of all sites that pose a significant risk to human health and the environment by 2050.
Okay, I see. And there's also a question by Joanna. The work in ECHA on the PFAS group restriction prepared now by member states might not be ready in time for the current Commission to make a proposal for the restriction. Do you think that ECHA committees can speed up this assessment so that the Commission is better placed time-wise to propose an action during its mandate?
No, I think we have to be here very clear. It's a very complex exercise, and it's not possible to speed up. So yeah, the work will continue with the next Commission, and the next Commission will act then.
Okay, I see. And a question from Michael. Will PFAS finally be recognized in the drinking water directive so that there would be an obligation to analyze drinking water for PFAS?
Yes, thank you very much. A very good question. The recast of drinking water directive includes limits on PFAS in drinking water, and work is ongoing to develop technical guidelines now for analytical methods by 2024. By 2026, member states have to take the necessary measures to ensure compliance with these limits at the tap. So basically, it's already there, and the work is ongoing.
Okay, wonderful. So we're basically waiting for the technical details, right, to be spelled out.
Correct.
Okay, wonderful. Then Pascal asked, the commissioner mentioned that medical devices may fall under the derogation from a total ban based on essential uses. Would that be a derogation for all medical devices? When is the timeline to have that confirmed? Oh, I think she's maybe looking a bit too far in the future.
Yes, but I can answer that, you know, we will have to look at the specifics. So definitely not all medical devices. We'll see as, again, evaluating is if it's for sure an essential new use, and then of course you know, we will need to have a full dossier from ECHA to define that. So there is no blank check for any of the groups that I mentioned. I mentioned them as an example, but that doesn't mean any blank check for the whole group, for example.
Oh, there's a bunch of questions which are more, let's say, going into a general direction on chemicals. Couldn't all hazardous chemicals be restricted? Couldn't there be certificates for hazardous chemicals? So the more hazardous your chemical is, the more expensive is your certificate. And also, wait, now my screen doesn't want to move. Yes, and no, fluoropolymers are not PFAS. So basically, they will not be part of the ban, I believe, right?
Yes, they are not. Wait. So let's start with the first part of the question, which you asked about the about you know, all hazardous chemicals and so on. So I think what's very important, how we're addressing it through the essential use. And of course, the essential use will be pushing out many of the hazardous chemicals, and then, you know, those that are proved that they are still needed for essential use, it doesn't mean that, you know, they sort of legitimize. We will keep on working, you know, to replace them. Now, you asked about the. What was the fluoropolymers? Yeah.
Whether there could be a harmfulness certificate.
Yeah, yeah. So they are PFAS and they are in the restriction.
Yeah, yeah, and also whether the fluoropolymers are also included.
Yeah, so this is what I mean, that they are included in the restriction.
Okay.
Yeah, PFAS.
Okay, but F gases are not, right?
Yes,
so,
they are as well.
No, I mean like sulfur hexafluoride or something like this will not be included, I believe, because they are not PFAS strictly spoken, and also 1, 2, 3, 4 YF and these sort of chemicals, because they're not clearly PFAS, right? So and they have a bit of a different chemical properties. So I don't think it would be appropriate to count them under the normal, so to speak, PFAS.
So they are, because they degrade to PFAS.
Oh, okay, I see. That's also a question here. Has there been any consideration of modifying the definition of PFAS to include only substances that have greater than or equal to carbon-fluorine bonds? That's the approach that the EPA is taking in the US.
So, you know, for now, we are working and we're using the OECD definition, which is, you know, recognized. And I think, again, here, you know, Jutta, very well in EU decision making, it's very hard to come out with new definitions and so on. That makes the process extremely hard. So we, of course, always in our work trying to rely on internationally recognized definitions. That definitely helps in our work.
Oh, there's a very interesting, very political question. If you now restrict or forbid these substances, might there be lawsuits in front of international courts as was foreseen in TTIP and also in CETA, because US, American or Canadian companies might see their rights of free trade restricted by such a ban?
I mean, it's not really political. It's more, I think, of a trade law question. But you know, same restrictions in EU are going to be applied as for imported. So we have this in many other areas as well. For example, you know, you can say that there is then the same risk for our deforestation legislation or other proposals. So these rules that we going to be applying, they're going to be WTO compatible, and they're going to be applicable the same for EU member states as for non-EU member states.
Yes, I think the question was a bit pointing to, there was this famous example where Australia had passed laws against tobacco use, and then they were sued. I can't even remember by whom, whether it was Philip Morris or another tobacco selling company. So that was basically what this question was adhering to. But I think that in this case, there might be a very good point on, we have to protect our people's health. And I'm not even sure whether Australia lost the case with the tobacco ban. But I think it's an interesting question.
No, absolutely. But you know, we always trying to work very careful with our legislation, ensuring, of course, that it does not. We do not leave any sort of loopholes, and yeah, we work also with stakeholders, ensuring that, you know, they are well consulted on the matters.
Yes, and there is a question from Gottfried. Will there be a label showing consumers that PFAS are present in the products? I think that it might be better to ban them in the first place, so you wouldn't need a label anymore.
Excuse me, could you repeat the question?
The question was, will there be an obligation to label a product containing PFAS, such as contains hazardous substances or contains alcohol or whatever?
Yeah, so it is being under consideration in addition to ban.
Okay, that's good. And there is another question: what about industrial use under strictly controlled conditions of PFAS to manufacture non-PFAS chemicals? I think that's exactly what you have been talking about, right? So if there is an essential use in the chemical industry where you need, let's say, a certain sort of lining of your equipment in order to make it viable to be used for a certain chemical reaction, then of course you could say, okay, this is an essential use. We have in the chemical industries procedures which have to be adhered in order to protect also the health of workers. And I think the main concern with PFAS is they must not be released in the environment, and they must not be affecting human health, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, as I said, you know, we need a assessment, and also when it comes to industrial, it's also going to be assessed in dossier.
Yes, certainly. But I was visiting BASF some weeks back, and they were very concerned. We need them in so many appliances in order to produce this and that and that and that. And I was always like, hey, keep cool. Our main concern is consumers' health and not necessarily use in an industrial context. So this, you would see this in the same way, right?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry. Yes.
Okay. Oh, does the Commission clearly agree on the goal of a total PFAS phase out, except for essential uses? or are we facing a very lengthy process of case-to-case assessment and regulation over the next decades?
So, you know, it's always not a very easy process, and I probably wished it to be a quicker process, but it will be, you know, it will be ongoing process, because again, you know, with essential use, as I said, we will have to continue work, and from the very beginning, you know, assessing dossiers and then seeing what's there, and then continue. Science will be advancing, and chemicals as well, and we might find, you know, replacements and etc. So that's, I don't think so that's a sort of the project that has a concrete end date, at least not from this point when I look at it. So we'll definitely need some time. We'll need a transitional period. As I said, we will be looking at alternatives and so on.
Yes. I would like to skip over the very detailed questions which people put in the chat here, because I think we're at the very beginning of the process. Absolutely. So we cannot tell you so much about the details. That will be, of course, discussed very thoroughly, and then we could talk about it. A last question from my side would be, when do you plan to revise REACH? What can we expect there?
So our plan, I can say when, first of all, what to expect. It's still
no, I just want the date. Yeah. I would be happy with the date.
So the plan is this year to start the revision of REACH at the end of the year.
Okay, that sounds reassuring. And I take it that we already,
but as you know, you have to be active in Parliament, because I hear from the European Parliament some signals by some groups about, you know, sort of pausing it or so in the context of war. So there is a work to be done with the members of the Parliament as well.
Yes, I know. It's really peculiar what this war is actually being pulled forward as a reason to postpone things. I mean, yeah, but never mind, this is a different discussion. Well, I know that you have a very, very limited time for us, so I thank you very much for the time that you dedicated for this webinar, and thank you again for your great leadership on environmental issues. And be assured, I will come back to you on the infringement procedures, you know, what we're talking about, and I'm happy to work with you together there. And now, without further ado, because we have a limited time, I would like to pass the floor to Anne-Sophie. And thank you so much, Virginia.
Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who participated and for the interesting discussion and interesting questions. And wish you a good Friday afternoon then. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. So, Anne, please, it's your turn.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this important topic and how to phase out regular PFAS most efficiently. That is the topic of my presentation. First, I want us to remember what we are talking about, the PFAS substances, a group of 5,000 toxic chemicals used in many consumer products, linked to various cancer, reduced fertility, and adverse effects on the immune system. And they're extremely persistent. They are forever chemicals. Many of us saw the movie Dark Waters, showing both the health effects on people exposed to PFAS in the US and the denial of the producer to know the effects of the PFAS. Another example that I want to highlight how the need for restrict PFAS, how important the need is to restrict it. 2 weeks ago, Denmark decided to lower the tolerant PFAS level in drinking water with 98%, because they realized that the older limits would not keep the water safe for the population. My country, Sweden, followed and also lowered the tolerant drinking water limit, almost the same level, but not really. If they would have taken the same level as Denmark, 50% of the drinking water in Sweden would be above the tolerant level of PFAS.
Wow.
So there is a huge problem. And earlier this year, researchers concluded that the planetary boundaries for chemicals are crossed, meaning that our planet are close to breakdown of the global ecosystems because of the number of chemicals and exposure to the environment of these chemicals. And PFAS is one big part of this incredibly huge problem. Next slide, please. So what are the companies' perceptions of PFAS? Do they want to use it in the products? I'm sure that all companies producing consumer products do not want to have such chemicals in the products. But very, very often, they don't know what is in their products. They don't get that information. Safety data sheets, SDE so-called, is like a bad joke among them. They need better and more information. Because without information about the chemicals, they can't take a decision what they want to use in their products. They don't have a chance to know that. And very often the companies get to hear that there are no alternatives. But there are alternatives to many, many uses. One story, for example, like say Coop Denmark, that's a chain of food or retailer stores, I would say. Some years ago, they decided to ban all PFAS from the packagings and they manage for all package, apart from the micro oven popcorn. So what should they do? Actually, they took it away from their shelves. They decided we can't sell it anymore. Because the producers that produced the package said, we can't have anything else. It's not possible. We can't offer an alternative. But they took them off the shelves. And it just took 3 months before the same producer came back and said, we do have a non-PFAS alternative now that you can use. Oh. So the popcorn came back on the shelves. At Chemsec, my organization, we started a PFAS movement, we call it. There are already now 85 companies, from multinational ones to small ones. And what they want is that the commission to phase out the PFAS as one big group. Because their hope is that this will make life easy for them. Then they could find alternatives and avoid regrettable substitution from one PFAS to something similar. And this would push the chemical industry to develop more alternatives. That is what they're hoping for. Next slide, please. Because voluntary actions are never so effective like regulations. Some companies voluntarily substitute and work intensively with these questions, but the majority do not, because there are not enough market advantages to substitute, and it's costly, and it's often difficult to find alternatives. So instead, the truth is, it's regulation, in particular, the anticipation of regulation that drives innovation. Innovation of new, safer chemicals, alternatives to PFAS. So when restricting PFAS, alternatives will come. I think this is important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So let us look at the ongoing restrictions of PFAS. I think it's great that the Commission and the member states are really tackling this. I'm happy with that. However, we tried to figure out what the different PFAS restrictions mean. Which chemicals are targeted by the different restrictions? So here we go as an explanation. The scale is not perfect, yeah? But we have based it on all available information we could get and done as good as possible. So C8, these chemicals, they are hardly used in Europe. They are POPs chemicals, so they're out, gone, unimportant. Then are the ones called C9 to C14, meaning 9 to 14 carbon atoms. They're often used today in textiles, carpets, paints, paper. And there are 2 other restrictions, PFHXA and PFXS. Let's call them C6 instead. Both of them have 6 carbon atoms in there. And they are used in a variety of products like firefighting foams, textiles, food contact material, cosmetics, semiconductors. And there we can see here, there's a complete overlap with one of the big yellow one and the small blue ones, firefighting foams. The case is actually that 95% of the firefighting foams will be regulated as well in the bigger restriction. And then we have the largest restriction, universal PFAS restriction. I'm sure Ms. Råleder will talk more about that one. But please keep this picture in mind, the overlap, when we go into the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows the relevance and importance of the ongoing restrictions in our view. And the horizontal level, you can see the direction, you see how far the restriction has progressed. So we look to the right, we see C8 is already law, it's in force. However, unimportant since the substances are not used in Europe. C9 to C14 is as good as it decided. It's important that it's used widely in the society. And then we have the other two restrictions that are in the middle there. There are done work, ECHA, and everyone else involved in this process has already spent very much time doing this work. And we think it's important restrictions. And then on the bottom here, you can see where it says not important at all, rather. It's actually firefighting foams in our view, because it's the overlap of 95% the same substances in the other restriction that they've already worked with. So we really think that it's unnecessary that now ECHA and everyone else are spending time again to do the same work. And that we really would like to see avoided in the future. And to the very left side, the University of PFAS, in our view, the most important one of the restrictions. So our conclusion is that we should focus on a universal restriction. That is where ECHA, Commission, all other actors should put their efforts in there. And we should use the knowledge we're gathering in the other processes, but don't do more double work. Next slide, please. So how to regulate PFAS, or how to do it the best way? I think in short, we would like to say that the European Union need to focus on the universal restriction. And the most important things are here. It needs to be strict. The exemption should be kept to bare minimum. And I realize that this is a difficult part, but this is necessary. Otherwise, the companies can't rely on this, really. They might get another chemicals they don't want. So it's needed to be as few exemptions as ever. Also keep in mind what I said before, is re-regulation and in particular anticipation of regulation, driving innovation to new other alternatives. And the second thing that's very, very important is, of course, it needs to be comprehensive, as we said, all PFAS substances, all uses, all 5,000 substances. So if we build it like this, as strict as possible, with few exemptions and comprehensive, all chemicals, all uses, then this would be the only regulation we need. And that would put an end to the forever chemicals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was really very comprehensive. And actually, up to now, I don't have so many questions. It's more like a comment saying I don't want companies to find substitutes for PFAS on a voluntary base. I want regulation and restrictions. And of course, we all agree there, because this is also the only way to actually have a level playing field by the end of the day, because if you don't make it mandatory, well, what happens? Some will do it and others won't, and the consumer won't even be able to find out who has been doing it. So of course, this is something that at least I, as a politician, am working on, that we have a level playing field and that we are protecting consumers' health and don't leave it to the responsibility of a company who says, well, we were searching and we did find an alternative. There's also the question, why couldn't some uses be forbidden right away? And until this is done, people just have to watch out when they buy, for example, certain vegetables from regions where we know that there's a lot of PFAS in the soil, which we know, but there is no obligation, as we have just heard from the commissioner, to actually monitor and also remedy those sites. So, but you have been looking all over Europe, Anne, is that true?
How do you mean we have been looking all over Europe? Sorry.
I mean, the examples were from Denmark and from Sweden, but I mean, obviously ChemSec is not restricted to those two countries, right?
No, not at all. I mean, when we look at the companies, for example, interested in the PFAS restriction, a broad PFAS restriction, there are companies from US, UK, Sweden, other countries that have signed up. It's just we thought, why don't we look around and see how the interest is? And then we found out that very many of them really wanted to get this support in their work, because it's such a heavy work as a company, or also as a big company, to find out which chemicals do I have in my products and what should I use instead. And to have these negotiations and dealings to find out alternatives. So they really say that, look, it will be much, much easier for us as a company if you phase out them completely at once altogether. Yeah.
Yes, and I should not let you go before letting you talk very briefly about the sin list.
The sin list. Yes, when REACH entered into force back then, we got questions from different companies in different countries, called us and said, oh God, which chemicals do you think the Commission will focus on? Which chemicals will be regulated under REACH? Which one will they put on the candidate list and authorization list? And then we thought, okay, let's see if we can find this out. So that is the background of the sin list. So the sin list is a list that uses the same criteria as under REACH for substances of very high concern. And then we looked at all the classified substances and added them to the list. So the majority of the substances on the sin list are classified in the European Union. Then there are some smaller groups that did not have classification yet in Europe, such as endocrine disruptors. Then we hired researcher and find it out what could we see could be a same level of concern and added these chemicals in there. And actually today, the sin list, I would say, is used widely, broadly from so many companies to know which chemicals should I not go for when I'm planning my next product? What should I try to avoid? And instead, where should I go instead? And I think that's really a sense with the entire REACH legislation, that it shows where the innovation should take place, not among these chemicals, but among other chemicals and other properties. So the aim for us is that sin lists really should help companies to know which chemicals to avoid and avoid them in their future production lines.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was basically just to have a bit, make it better known, let's call it like that, because I must admit I only found out about the sin list when I came to Brussels, although I've been interested in the issue before. So that was basically my aim to make it better known. Oh, thanks. Time is flying by. Thank you very much, Anna. And I will just hand over the floor to Christiane, who will now tell us, let's say, she'll give us the German perspective, right?
Thank you very much. First, thank you, Jutta, for starting this webinar, because I think it's a very important issue. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity to present the regulatory work on PFAS currently performed by the REACH authorities in the Netherlands, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. This regulatory proposal targets the problem of one of the largest single substances groups ever regulated under REACH. It is therefore probably also one of the most ambitious regulatory proposals under REACH till date. First, I would like to start with some background information on PFAS. PFAS has been widely used since the 50s of the 20th century, since they have very useful properties like being water and oil repellent and very durable. I would expect that all of us have been in regular contact with PFAS during our lifetime, or maybe regularly, from pan coating over outdoor clothing to medical products. But it has also been discussed at least for 30 years that these substances also give rise to concern based on just these properties, and we've already heard something about that. So first I want to give you some examples. There's hardly a week where there's no media coverage on the PFAS issue. As a first example, I want to shortly show you the case of a factory in Flanders in Belgium that has been producing semiconductors for decades. Since this production also used PFAS, today the area surrounding factories heavily contaminated, which led inter alia to a temporary production shutdown. Regulation on the consumption of foodstuff like eggs and high costs to remediate the environment, if that's possible at all. Another example, I would like to highlight the media coverage in the United States. Here, the main focus of the discussion is on the very wide contamination of drinking water in many counties, towns, and cities. Although packaging materials, especially for fast food like hamburgers and pizza, have been discussed in the last few years as PFAS are used frequently in them, which could lead to health effects, but it is also problematic if these packaging materials are recycled. As we've heard before, the main problem with PFAS is that they are extremely persistent in the environment, and that's why they are called forever chemicals. Every emission to the environment will remain there for decades or maybe even centuries, and as currently emissions are continuing, the concentration in the environment is steadily rising. And at this picture, you can see that there's one thing all these substances have together. This is this very, very strong connection between the C and the F, and this is the problem of all PFAS substances. With regard to health effects, it is known that the exposure to certain PFAS has negative effects, as shown in the graphic on the right side of the slide. This can be effects on the liver and the thyroid system, increased cholesterol levels, but also effects on unborn child. Probably some PFAS can also cause kidney and testicular cancer. Unfortunately, for most PFAS, our knowledge is still limited or completely missing. But the structural similarities between different PFAS means that it's very likely that all PFAS have the potential for certain health effects and also for severe health effects. Also, different PFAS could possibly work in combination. The group of PFAS is very large, with at least almost 5,000 substances. As you can see on the right side of the slide, there are many different subgroups. You can't read this, but it just shows you that it's very, very many subgroups. And all share the structural motif as I've shown on the other slide. Likewise, all PFAS share the problem that I mentioned before. Sooner or later, they degrade to a substance that will not degrade further and be extremely persistent in the environment. Also, it is important to understand that while PFAS have been widely used since the 1950s, they are actually synthetic chemicals, meaning they are not found in nature. Due to their unique properties, PFAS are used in a wide variety of uses, as you can see on this slide, but it has already been mentioned by others. And as some of these uses are essential for society, like for example certain pharmaceuticals or the use of certain processes in electronics, regulating PFAS appropriately becomes even more challenging. But as it has been said before, it's also the ban can also be a driver for innovation to have alternatives. Nevertheless, for almost 15 years, regulators have been working on this challenge. Today, some of the most important PFAS, like for example, P4A or Gen X, have been identified as substances of very high concern under the EU chemicals regulation REACH. With this SVHC identification, these substances have been targeted for a mid to long-term substitution. Also, the manufacture, placing on the market and use of certain PFAS their salts and their related substances were already banned EU-wide via so-called restrictions under REACH. That was on another slide by Anne-Sophie Becker before. Unfortunately, these restrictions had not the intended effects of phasing out the uses of PFAS. Instead, a shift to the use of other PFAS with similar problematic properties has occurred. This phenomenon is sometimes called regrettable substitution, and this recently led to the decision to widen the regulatory approach concerning PFAS. The new approach aims to regulate all uses of all PFAS within one restriction process in order to prevent the shift to other so far unregulated PFAS. The broad restriction could in principle also cover uses of PFAS that are currently seen to be essential for society and for which no alternatives are available. In order to avoid such unintended consequences of the restriction, these uses will be identified and exempted. Of course, regulating such a large substance group that is used in so many different fields is very complex and a huge amount of work. Therefore, the authorities of the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway joined forces and now work together on preparing this huge regulatory proposal. The authorities of the Netherlands and Germany are coordinating the project. So, what is planned in detail? You can find the current plan for regulating PFAS in the so-called Registry of Intention on the website of the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA. The definition of PFAS follows the definition used by the OECD. The scope of the proposal is to restrict the manufacture, placing on the market, and use of PFAS. The reasons for the proposal are mainly the persistence of PFAS in the environment, leading to exposure and accumulation there. This has led to contamination of surface, ground, and drinking water and soil that, if continued, will only become worse, as the removal of PFAS is very difficult and extremely costly. As mentioned before, it is also argued that some PFAS are toxic for human health and environment. Finally, I would like to present the currently planned timeline for the PFAS restriction. As of today, the 5 authorities currently prepare the regulatory proposal in form of a so-called restriction dossier under REACH, which shall be submitted in January next year to the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA. After this submission, ECHA's 2 independent scientific committees will assess the content of the dossier and develop their opinion, which they will submit to the European Commission until March 2024. In this phase, it will also be possible for all the stakeholders, as well as everyone else interested in the proposal, to submit their opinion and information in a consultation running between March and September 2023. Probably in summer 2024, the European Commission could make a formal restriction proposal to the REACH committee, which will discuss and vote on it. It is hard to speculate here, but with respect to the broad scope and the complexity of the restriction, I think an entry into force of the restriction cannot be expected before 2025, but I hope very much that we will reach to have that at 2025. But with this, a universal restriction for all non-essential uses of all PFAS would be in place in the whole EU. That would be a big step forward in protecting human health and the environment from these chemicals. And I think it is very, very important that that we look very closely to what is the essential use in the different uses that we have for the PFAS, because I think there are a lot of things where maybe there is an alternative or where it's not really essential. And so with this hopeful outlook, I end my short presentation, and thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm looking forward for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiane. That was, again, a lot of information at the same time. There is one question from Jonathan. The timeline does not seem to feature a transition period. Would the restriction apply as of beginning of 2025? Interesting question,
normally,
right?
It's an interesting question. Normally, the transition period is discussed in this regulatory in this process that we have with the regulation. So we do not yet know which transition period there will be.
Yes, actually, most of the time there is some sort of transition period because obviously you can expect processes to be changed over a period of weeks, but there is a big but. Everyone who has been paying attention those last 2 years, I might say, of course, knows that there is something coming and something in the pipeline. So if I were a CEO whose business is using PFAS, I would make sure that I would have been starting to search for alternatives probably 1.5 years ago, because inevitably some sort of restriction will come, and better be safe than be sorry. So substituted now, that's the acronym. The SINLIST is the acronym for substituted now, because that's exactly what ChemSec is doing. They're looking at the dossier saying, okay, these and these and these chemicals are problematic. We can be pretty sure that there will be some sort of restriction coming. So it might be a good idea to start looking for an alternative now, because else you might have a very nasty surprise afterwards.
I think that there are also a lot of industry companies that are already looking for alternatives, and they who have already banned PFAS out from their products. Just before this webinar, I looked at outdoor clothes at some websites to see if what's the policy. And the one normally where I buy my clothes, because I knew that they look at their supply chain. I was looking what they are doing with PFAS, and they've already banned it from their products. So, but some others say they will ban it from their products. Now they've banned it from this and this and this. And for some others, they have the goal to achieve that in 2023. For others, they are on delay to their own plans. So there is a movement already. It's not enough, but so I think, especially in some consumer products, we have already some consciousness at some businesses. In other consumer product fields, I heard yesterday somebody with some examples where I thought, no, there's a little bit of lack of consciousness. So it's very different from industry to industry.
Yes, there are two, let's say, questions or comments. One anonymous says, many thanks for this very interesting presentation. The definition of essential use will not be finalized by the time of the dossier submission in January 2023. How will the 5 member states consider if some derogations be possible based on essential use concept? Thank you very much. So basically, if we don't know yet what is an essential use, how can you actually impose a ban?
We have, you have to distinguish two things. One is the general approach of essential use. And the other one is what's essential use of PFAS. Because will be first with the PFAS regulation, we have to look from we have to look at all the different uses singularly. So we will not have one headline where we distinguish which is essential use and which is not. We will have to look what's about outdoor clothes, what's about cosmetics, and so on. So, for example, at outdoor clothes, I would say, for me, even if I really like to have outdoor clothes that keep me dry, because I'm a lot outdoor, I would say I don't need this. So even if I'm not dry anymore, but there are alternatives at the moment, because there are companies that manage producing really good outdoor clothes without PFAS in it. So, so we will have to look at each of these uses.
Yes, and basically, I think actually it would be possible to have some headlines. So, for example, as you just mentioned on clothes, there might be a possibility to exempt certain clothes which are needed in very, very dangerous environments where you could not do without blah, 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 but this is very, very limited. So everyday clothes sold to the common consumer would probably be not considered essential, nor will a frying pan be considered essential use of PFAS, because I do own frying pans, I don't own any with PFAS. So it is possible to use a frying pan without having to use PFAS. So I think there might be general headlines as such, like, should we at all look at the private consumers' surroundings? Because this, of course, is an environment which is not very much regulated or controlled, as opposed to industry, where in industry you have all sorts of inspections and all sorts of liabilities. So every company will make sure that they will not impede the health of their workers, because they will really get into trouble, at least in Germany and in the European Union. They will, not so much in India or Bangladesh, I might say, but at least in the European Union, there are very strong laws protecting workers' health. And therefore, we can be assured that in industry, it is much easier to control such hazardous substances, as is being done with other hazardous substances too. So the question of Peter, could you please give one example of what is presently regarded as an essential use of PFAS? The concept is not yet ready, so we cannot tell you about anything that is regarded as an essential use at the present stage, because we haven't applied it to PFAS. There is, of course, the concept of essential use. The most well-known precedent is, of course, the Montreal Protocol, when we're talking about the fluorochlorinated gases, which were before that very, very frequently used in everyday products, until it was found out, oh, okay, they damaged the ozone layer, that's not good. And then there was this concept of essential use invented, let's say. So to say, okay, these are highly useful substances, but we should reserve them for cases where there is no real viable alternative, and spraying your hair is not one of them. So basically that was the concept which was introduced with the Montreal Protocol, and I guess we will do something similar on PFAS. There's a question to Christiane. Considering the long timeline at EU level, is the German government considering moving ahead and ban PFAS at national level for certain most sensitive consumer products, such as food contact paper, as Denmark did?
We really want to have this on a European level. Anyway, it is not possible because we have this harmonized. So we have EU regulation where it is not possible to have different regulations at national level. But anyway, it is also more effective to have this at a European level. And I think we also have to look at the international level. Often after European regulation, this is also widened to an international level. But anyway, we have also to restrict the placing of the market of products that are not compliant with our law, normally this is the case, that also the placing on the market is restricted, but we have big loopholes on this at the online marketplaces, and there we have this the DSA now, but it does not really assure that online marketplaces have to put down things from their sites and that they really have to check. And so we hope that maybe in the product safety regulation it is possible to go a little bit further, but this is something we will continue working on.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that Sylvia wrote. It's a global problem. So is there a global time scale already on how to tackle it on a global scale? Well, we don't have a truly global agreement on chemicals, do we? At least if we had, I would know about it. So of course, there are global negotiations on certain chemicals and such, but as far as I know, there is nothing that is banned on a global level besides, of course, what I was just talking about, fluorochlorinated compounds, but that was basically not for health reasons, but rather for reasons of damaging ozone layer. But maybe Anne can help me out here.
We have different international conventions. One very important is the Stockholm Convention. We also have the Stockholm Plus 15 at the beginning of June.
If I may add something, I mean,
sorry. Please.
Yes, I want just to say that if you should wait for international agreements, it takes extremely long time. So then it's not useful at all. It's better to focus that Europe goes ahead. And then since we have a global market, other places might follow if they have to follow the same laws as say when they're selling to Europe. So it's most important is that Europe goes ahead with a broad restriction. And I think coming to the essential use, I would like to add, I think the question is not, it gets so difficult to say what is essential. It could be essential, very different for each person. So I think we should avoid that kind of discussion. The discussion is rather which products are so essential to the society that we can accept that they need to exist, even if they contain very hazardous chemicals or hazardous chemicals for humans and environment. Then we get a completely different answers, what we really need for society. Then they're asking if clothes are essential. Of course, clothes are essential in general terms, but it's not so that we need hazardous chemicals in our clothes.
Thank you very much for this comment. I absolutely agree. And maybe it sounded a little bit different what I said before, but that's really what I mean. Also, we have to look what is essential for society. I just argued that also for me, if I really use these things, and I would say, no, it's not essential for society. Maybe some persons think they like it, too, but I think then maybe you don't know what's in it. And so for the society, for the whole society, it is not necessary to have it close, not in cosmetics, and there are a lot of other things where you really don't need PFAS for the society. It's rather maybe some medical use, something like that, if there's really no alternative for some uses.
Yes, and even then, of course, it would be favorable if research were being done on replacing it also in those use areas where we don't see an alternative right now. I remember when the Montreal Protocol was passed, we still had uses on there for those FCKW, it's in German, so fluorochlorinated carbon compounds, which today are rather obsolete because you didn't need it anymore, right? So basically things can evolve, but let's start and let's be fast, because we have already lost a lot of time, and there are many contaminated sites all over Europe, and this is of course not good. And I would really urge also the Commission. I mean, Virginius is not here anymore, but I will be in contact with him anyway on other issues, and I will remind him that we should better go forward more quickly and not lose any more time, instead of trying to think everything very meticulously through and starting with a proposal in, I don't know, 2 or 3 years' time. And I was a bit taken aback when he said, well, probably we will not be able to finish it within the mandate of this commission. I was like, oh my God, I thought that we should, but yeah, it's another 2 years, and then this commission will be gone, or maybe Virginius will even stay, who knows? But yeah, so we should think ahead right now. Johanna has a comment saying that there are so many children which are where PFAS can be measured in the blood. For example, this was found out within the project HBM for EU. And so why couldn't we take measures on the national level in order to protect our children?
So, as I said before, the national national regulation is really is not possible. It is not allowed, because the European chemicals law is binding for all the member states, and it's binding in every direction. We have to manage it exactly in the way the European law is fixed, is regulated. But anyway, the national regulation would not be really faster.
So is it banned in Denmark or not? Because Denmark is bound by the same European laws. Actually, I don't know.
I mean, it's possible as countries to go ahead, and then you have to get an agreement on the European level that this restriction is allowed to do. But the cases where you don't have the legal requirement harmonized, then you can go ahead. But I think, I mean, we have limited resources. Everyone has this, and there are many parts that are covering by the PFAS restrictions. So to me, it's very important that these countries goes ahead jointly and work on this and put the resources to find and to allow as few exemptions as possible. I think that is the most efficient way to go ahead to work with this broad restriction, focusing on finding where do we find all alternatives, and not have too many exemptions, very rare, very few exemptions. That's the most efficient way to go ahead with a complete PFAS problem today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I have something I also want to add to the question, which kind of regulation where we can go further at the national level. With water regulations, we can go further, but we cannot go further with really prohibiting at all some chemicals. That's something we can't do. We can set our level, which how much PFAS, for example, is accepted in the drinking water. That we can do on the national level. That we can have different regulations, but not prohibit the use of certain kinds of chemicals. We can't prohibit to use it at all. So
yes, I don't think it's a complete ban, what Denmark has been doing. I think Denmark only restricted it in food contact materials or something. Of course, this is an IMCO problem, internal market problem, because we want this internal market. We want every company to be able to sell their products all over the EU. So basically, this is a trade constraint. I'm not sure how that this was resolved, but actually I have the gut feeling that we should go ahead there, and in case there's a problem with trade issues, then at least we could try and solve it on a bilateral base.
So
Okay, not
didn't
someone
get the
says
question.
not all PFAS are hazardous. Please stop spreading misinformation. They're persistent. We need to avoid their emissions into the environment. They're not all bioaccumulative, toxic, mobile, etc. Often they're actually an alternative to chemicals known to be toxic or unsafe. Last but not least, society needs durable chemicals where durability is critical for realization in technologies and applications contributing to decarbonization, renewable energy, and so forth. That was more a comment than an actual question, I guess.
I mean, we don't know the properties of all PFAS. That is true. We don't know them. But we know that if they're very structure similar, in very many cases, they do have the same properties. And since such a big lack of data for so many chemicals that are similar structural, we can assume that they will have the same properties. And if we would look at each single of them, then we are back in the normal thing again. It takes years for each chemical to be substituted. When the fact is that we find it in 97% of the population, we see the health effects. So it might be so that some chemicals not that, but the truth is that it's most likely have the same structural properties, the most same properties. So therefore we need to tackle them all together.
Yeah, and we know that we have these risks and these diseases that are caused by certain PFAS, that we have these similarities. And I think, how long do we want to wait if we have really the proof that this substance, one of these 5,000 different substances, that every single one of these substances has exactly the same problems? As we have had seen until now, with the scientific proof and really good research, we know that all the PFAS that have been assessed in depth with their effects, that there is no PFAS that is really absolutely harmless, because the persistence as itself is a risk. It's a very high risk, and so we really risk to poison our planet, and I think that's why we have to act, and why we want to act together with the other countries in this regulation. And I think it's really for the common good, it's for our health, for the environment.
Yes, I very much agree. And as Anna has said, if we would like to go for a very detailed and sophisticated approach, and we would like to look at 4,700 substances, well, you can easily do the math that we will be done probably in the year 3,407 or something like that. And we cannot wait so long. So I think we should really go the other way, say, okay, we'll set a restriction, and if anyone wants to do something with a substance which has been restricted for a good reason or whatever, then there can be an application to have a derogation from the restriction. But then the burden of proof that it is harmless is on the shoulders of the ones who want to use it. And well, knowing the Commission, usually those derogations are being given. I mean, I'm reading this nearly every week. We always receive this list of what the Commission has been doing, because we as Parliament have the right to object to the Commission's doing if we think that the Commission has overstepped their competencies. So basically, we always read things like company XYZ wants to use, let's say, chromium-6, which is of course restricted, but the company says we need it for this and that process, and we're doing that to protect our workers, and we're monitoring the blood of the workers, blah, blah, blah. And there's the assessment by the risk committee and the socioeconomic committee, and then those derogations are usually granted, because the Commission knows very well that it might be detrimental to the industrial strength of Europe if we were too restrictive on these issues. But I always like to make sure, so I'm looking at all these derogations very carefully. I do like to make sure that no workers are being brought in hazardous surroundings, that it is really an essential use, so that we are not talking about, I don't know, a new color of textile, but really something that is of a general use towards society. But just to give this impression to the audience, the Commission is always looking at issues from all sides, and usually the socioeconomic side is not one that is overlooked, to say the very least, rather on the contrary. So we're fastly running towards 16:30, so I would like to give the floor for maybe last 2 minutes to each of the two panelists who are still with us. There are still quite a few questions, but a lot of them are very detailed. And as said before, we are at the very beginning of the process. So please have a bit of patience here, because we will see things coming in the next years. So Anna, will you start?
To summarize what I said before, I would say the most important right now is to go ahead with this universal restriction and to get it strict, to keep the exemptions really to a minimum. There will come alternatives. Also for the users, we will not have alternatives for today. Many of them, they become alternatives when the process is starting, when we force this to go ahead with the regulation. And it needs to be comprehensive, all PFAS, all uses. And as you said before, if it's needed for some cases and essential for use, then it can be allowed to be used. But otherwise, it will be a restriction, and it's needed for all our health. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Christiane, please.
So also thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very, very glad that we have the possibility to work on this universal restriction, and that we have the connection between our authorities in the reach, so we can work together with other countries at the European level to launch this proposal for this restriction. And I hope that we will be as fast as possible with it.
Yes, that I hope also. And well, I would like to thank the two of you. Of course, also our wonderful audience who has brought forward really interesting questions. As I said, we cannot answer all of them, but hopefully some of them will answer themselves in the weeks and months to come. And last but not least, I would like to thank our wonderful staff who made this webinar possible, who did everything to make sure that technically everything is running smooth, that no one is left behind, and who are always there to help us with their knowledge and their services. So thank you very much there. And as said, all webinars can be found on my homepage. And this week I had some issues around climate, environment and health, which was very interesting. And yeah, so without further ado, I would like to thank everyone again and wish everyone a very nice toxic-free weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.